Well, thank you, Monica, and a very great pleasure it is, first of all, to have been here for the day so far, because we've had some very interesting conversations, and a particular pleasure to moderate this panel. So I'm going to start by inviting Brendan Frank to come up and join us on the stage. So Brendan, if you'd just come up. Yeah, you're allowed. It's okay. She's not your boss anymore. So I just a couple of seconds to introduce the panel. Is that the title, as you'll know from your materials, is concerns partisan polarization and intergovernmental collaboration, finding politically viable pathways, which of course is ultimately what it comes down to when you are involving people in a democratic society. Another way of putting it, perhaps a bit too glibly, is in a sense, this could be called the "How do we deal with all of these issues without yelling at each other" panel. Or yet another way, perhaps a little bit more seriously, how do we get a discussion centered on Canada's long-term success rather than the immediate needs of political partisans or various stakeholders. So with that in mind, we have four panelists. Chief Gale has been introduced already and has given us her initial perspectives. So we're going to lead things off with Brendan. Brendan is a former colleague at Positive Energy. He's now a senior consultant at Innovate Research Group, where his work is focused on energy transition and public opinion. And Brendan's going to speak about some recent work that he did for Positive Energy to kick things off. And then the next two speakers will be known to, I assume, known to pretty much everyone. And in a context where for the last several hours, we've been talking a lot about collaboration, consensus building, how to actually move things forward across partisan lines. They are in fact co-chairs of the recently created Coalition for a Better Future. And as it happens, both are former ministers of Natural Resources Canada, among their many other accomplishments, with whom I had the privilege to work, albeit in different capacities, going back almost 3 decades. So it's a particular pleasure to welcome them. Specifically, Lisa Raitt, who I can see on the screen here, has extensive experience in both public and private sectors, and from her experience, both past and current, is eminently well suited to speak on this topic. And Anne McClellan, who I also see on the screen, welcome Anne. Like Lisa, in addition to her deep familiarity with the workings of government, has a great breadth of experience in the issues on which we're focused today. So we'll go in that order. I'm going to turn it over to Brendan. Feel free to speak from the chair if you wish, or from the podium if you wish, and then we'll have the other speakers, and then we'll move to question and answer. So Brendan, up to you.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you, Monica, for the invitation. So I spent 2.5 memorable years at Positive Energy, and my research in that time was largely focused on two things. It was polarization around energy and climate issues and consensus building around energy and climate issues. And polarization it's a very broad term. We've heard some concepts today that actually we can parse a little bit. And I hope I can introduce some ideas that maybe tie some of the themes together that we've heard. So if you ask the Canadian public a question, you'll get a certain percentage who express strong views about any particular subject. And when we're talking about polarization, that's really what we care about. Who strongly agrees, who strongly disagrees, who's very concerned about something. And taking it a step further, who feels strongly enough to take action. And when you ask the public about energy and climate change, it turns out that partisan ID is a really good predictor of people's opinions on a number of controversial issues, more so than ideology or region or age or gender. These strong opinions, they're clustered along partisan lines. And the final piece of research I did for Positive Energy was a large qualitative study where we interviewed 50 leaders and decision makers, mostly in the energy and climate space, to get a better sense of how they understand these dynamics, how did we end up in our current state on energy and climate politics? And taking that as a given, where do we go next? How do we actually build consensus? So we identified some drivers, some events that have actually led us to our current state, but I want to focus more on the solutions and recommendations that we uncovered. So our analysis identified 3 important limits to consensus building that stem from partisan politics. First is what's called toxic partisanship. The second is called us versus them, or Ed Whittingham previously referred to it as you're with us or you're against us. Very much the same idea. And the final concept is false polarization. And I'll take those one at a time. So toxic partisanship is essentially a level of partisan rancor that makes compromise or agreement difficult or even impossible. And I'm sure examples come to mind for everyone when we talk about that. We have a fairly good idea of how identities form and how in-groups and out-groups are created, and how that influences how we perceive the world and how we make decisions. And it takes almost nothing for someone to sort themselves into an in-group or an out-group. In some experimental settings, just arbitrarily assigning labels to someone and not someone else is enough to produce out-group discrimination. And one of the challenges in partisan spaces is that discrimination against outgroups isn't challenged or condemned the way other forms of discrimination are. And in many contexts, it's encouraged. And it can be beneficial for you and your in-group if you're selectively unkind to your partisan opponents. And toxic partisanship is on the rise in Canada. And it just makes it much harder to seek common ground on issues, both across governments, within governments. If you don't like each other, that can often be enough on its own to stop consensus building, even if you agree on some fundamental issues. And the nature of partisanship is that it is an identity, and that's not a problem in and of itself. And what we put forward in the paper is that downplaying partisan stripes may not actually be desirable. One of the solutions that we came up with that Marissa mentioned earlier is actually cross-partisanship. That's leveraging partisanship to show that there are actually issues that we can tackle across partisan lines. And I actually think cross-partisanship is more interesting than partisanship for a few reasons. It's more inclusive. It can take on several different forms, and it can thrive in both political and non-political settings. And being civil and being publicly civil with partisan opponents, there's a real appetite for it. And I think my fellow panelists will be able to speak to that in some detail. We also have a number of successful institutional models in Canada that have leveraged this cross-partisan strategy. And the final thought I want to put on the table before handing it over is false polarization. And that's basically a mistaken perception of how polarized you actually are with someone who you disagree. And there's actually decent data and evidence to suggest that this is a pretty serious problem in Canada. And there's a pretty vicious feedback loop at work here. If you think you're polarized, you are more likely to absorb information that confirms that narrative and dismiss information that does not adhere to that narrative, even if that's the truth. And when it comes to solutions, there's actually pretty solid consensus on a lot of the big picture issues on the energy transition, as we've heard today. And they actually enjoy pretty broad consensus across partisan lines. Clean tech, energy efficiency, reliability measures, energy security. And it's really less important to agree on the why than on the what of these policies. And in the last 18 months, there's actually been a ton of literature emerging on false polarization specifically. I can talk about that later if anyone's curious. But a lot of it really comes down to how we frame the debate and who we choose to debate with. I'll leave it there, but thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Concepts to work with there, and we can come back to them. So thank you for that. And Lisa, why don't I turn it over to you for some comments?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's weird because usually Ann and I share a space. We don't actually get our own time. So I'm going to assume that I'm sharing here with Ann. So Ann, turn on your microphone so we can give them a twofer instead of having me talk to them first and then and then you have your word. But of course you can, and I'm used to Anne going first, Mike, so I'm going to apologize for that and throw it to Anne to actually explain who the coalition is, and then maybe we can talk about the nonpartisan nature of it. What do you think, Anne? Is that cool?
Absolutely. Yeah. And good to see you, Mike Cleland. It's been a while.
Yep.
But great to see you again.
Oh, indeed.
And good afternoon, everyone. The coalition is 100, right now, 131 organizations, big and small, private sector, nonprofit, and charitable sector coming together to focus around one agenda: inclusive, sustainable economic growth. And how did this all happen? Because we've got the big guys, the BCC guys, we've got the chambers, we've got small business, we've got United Ways Canada, we've got Imagine Canada, we've got Goodwill Industries of Canada, and Arts and Performing, and Chief Gale. We're really pleased to say that we have a number of Indigenous organizations, I believe, including your own.
Yes.
The Major Projects Coalition as part of our coalition. And I think the fact that we talk about coalitions, Mike, is actually not by accident, right? Coalitions come together to work on a particular project or goal. And that's what we're about at the Coalition for a Better Future. These 131 organizations felt that there wasn't sufficient sustained focus on long-term growth. But the other thing we knew was that long-term growth in and of itself couldn't be the goal. It had to be inclusive and sustainable economic growth. We had to do things differently. As Carolyn Wilkins, who's a member of our advisory board, said, economic growth, absolutely. We need a plan for that growth, but it has to be the right growth. And I was so pleased when I listened to Chief Gale earlier talk about the involvement in so many groundbreaking projects across this country, because think for how long, Mike and Lisa, we've been involved with the Department of Natural Resources. Indigenous Canadians and Indigenous communities weren't at the table, or quite honestly, Mike, they were an afterthought at NRCan for a long time. So that doesn't work anymore. That's the wrong kind of economic growth going forward. So that's what we're about. We are a group, a very large group. We represent millions and millions of Canadians when you think about who's employed in a lot of these organizations of one kind or another, or industrial sectors. We have come together because we actually don't like the polarization. We don't like the inability of people to talk to each other about issues that are so important to every Canadian's long-term prosperity and quality of life. So we kind of got the message, at least our members have, in terms of the fact that we need to talk and listen to each other respectfully. And then we need to figure out mechanisms by which we can take what we know and what we've learned and in fact engage others, and certainly all three orders of government, but civil society in those respectful conversations. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Anne. And it's a perfect segue because, as Anne pointed out, the inclusive sustainability, long-term growth that we talk about wasn't something that Anne McClellan and Lisa Raitt figured out on the back of a cocktail napkin. In fact, it was a survey of all of the members asking them what was important. And there was 97% agreement on that kind of growth: inclusive, sustainable. We had a conference about it almost a year ago now, Anne, in October. And what Anne points out is actually the very salient point of the coalition. We talk to each other. We're not there to compete with each other, to talk to the government and get the government's attention. We talk to each other, and from that, we're able to engage with public policymakers. And it actually brings a fairly good amount, I would say, of practical advice and practical content to policymakers, because you have a Liberal former cabinet minister, former deputy prime minister, and you have a former Conservative cabinet minister who are working together on this. And all of the parties know us well enough, Mike, to know that I'm not going to let Anne get away with anything in terms of speaking points, and she's not going to let me get away with anything in terms of talking points for the Conservatives. So it's a wash. It's like, it's a standoff. We're going to be fine. We're going to absolutely make sure that the path we're on is not going to be tainted by partisanship. And I so appreciated the research that we just heard about, because even when the message is meant to be helpful and it's meant to move the debate along, it can get muddied when there's a perception of partisanship. And I'll give you the great example. Bill Morneau, the former finance minister here in Canada, gave a speech at CD Howe last week. And he was talking about the stuff that we talk about, the importance of long-term growth, getting out of transactional politics, thinking about the long term and what matters, and getting our economy rolling for our kids and grandkids. But the coverage of his speech was all about some partisan insights he gave during the speech instead of the content. That's why nonpartisanship is so important, because it's clean. We can be approached by an NDP opposition government. We can also be approached by a conservative majority government. We can be approached by a liberal majority government, or a liberal NDP hybrid contract coalition organization.
Yeah.
All that being said, we talk to everybody and we talk to anybody, and it allows the public policymakers to not get caught up in what I was caught up in all of these elections from 2008 until 2019 when I lost, which is, what do I have to promise on the economy in order to get the right amount of votes in the right constituency at the right time so I can win a majority government and fulfill my platform? And that, to me, isn't the way forward. And we are seeing that happen in terms of our rankings in the OECD for long-term growth going forward, where Canada is not doing very well compared to the rest of the G20. So we're worried, and lo and behold, 131 organizations are worried about it as well. And we're very grateful that you invited us here today for the positive discussion. And we've been invited to some really interesting places to talk about long-term economic growth. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that they know we are studiously nonpartisan. And, well, quite frankly, we're entertaining as heck too, Anne, because we do get our jibes in once in a while on each other, and they enjoy that. But it's definitely a selling point. And I think it's something that's worth having a larger discussion on, and creating the path where politicians can actually put down arms and work together in a meaningful way.
Lisa, I was struck by some of the things Brendan was saying. Do you know what it reminds me of? Our deliberative democracy exercise.
Yeah.
Right, Brendan, I don't know whether you followed the work. It's 3 Canadian NGOs who had Lisa and me co-chair the first ever and largest deliberative democracy exercise done in Canada. Stanford University put it's their model in terms of how you identify the groups and all of that. But Lisa, do you want to say a bit about that? Because I was struck by the fact that, it's not always about getting people to agree about everything, but it is about the respectful discussion and walking away saying, you know what, I like these people better.
Indeed. And that was the end result that Stanford actually gave to the organizers of this. And it was an experiment. So basically, across Canada, there are 400 individuals asked to fill out a survey questionnaire on their opinion on foreign affairs issues. From that point, they were provided nonpartisan, neutral information. They were also provided access to experts in the area in a nonpartisan, neutral way to ask questions. And then they were put into an AI moderated chat group. And they were allowed to discuss the issue that they had, or the question that they had in front of them. And these are people from all across the country, very different backgrounds. Now, as Anne pointed out, that's the magic of making sure that is representative. Everybody didn't agree. In fact, sometimes they didn't convince each other either way. But what did happen is that after the fulsome discussion, there was better understanding of each other and actual respect for each other. And unfortunately, it was a finding that surprised them, because in the United States, they're not there. They're not getting that point where people can listen to one another and be okay to disagree and respect each other and still think about each other. So that really important piece of work, and I hope that people look it up, because it was an eye opener for me, not only to have AI moderated, which was stunning, but as well to get that result, knowing that we can have serious conversations as long as the information is nonpartisan and factual. And we didn't have people saying, well, I don't believe this, that those are your facts, not my facts.
Yeah.
It was really super interesting. And could I spot conservatives in the room? 100%. I knew exactly who they were because I could tell from the way they were approaching issues, but it never broke down to partisan talk.
Here just
We
in
can't
case,
hear. Okay.
sorry.
Now
Okay.
I can hear you.
I couldn't hear you either. Okay.
Yeah, you can hear me now? Okay, yeah. And rather than just going straight to questions, I was going to see, Brendan, whether you wanted to respond to Anne and Lisa's comments on the last point, but and then maybe ask if Chief Gale would like to comment as well.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with that particular study, although it sounds fascinating, but it does get to a concept that you see quite often in the literature, which is that the best way to get people who don't like each other to like each other more is to interact with each other and actually have a conversation, typically moderated. And this is one of the challenges, I believe it was on the third panel, discussing the hyperpartisan nature of social media. And I think that's one of the key challenges, is that you're more likely to form your opinion about other groups based on what people in your group actually think of them, rather than having that conversation yourself.
Yeah, okay. Chief Gale, would you like to sort of jump into this conversation?
Yeah, I just think that, you know, one piece that seems to be missing in some of these conversations is the Indigenous lens. And I feel that, you know, it's challenging sometimes for communities to get out there and work with others because there's no willingness. And then, you know, in other scenarios, there's a lot of willingness, and there's a lot of people leading by example in, you know, industry that, you know, want to work with our communities. Ultimately, I think, you know, our perspective is really important to be able to drive this transition and just to really change policy and regulation that meets the needs of our communities. When I think about our geothermal project that's happening in Fort Nelson First Nation territory, which is 100% owned by us, there's going to be some challenges and difficult conversations that we're going to need to have when it comes to selling our power. And we want to be able to sell our power to whoever we want. We don't want to be bogged down by, you know, the provincial government's policies and regulations. So I think just by coming together and just hearing what a nation has to bring, or what a nation's concerns or challenges are, and, you know, taking another look at that, like, how do we really move forward together? Because if these projects are built in our communities, I mentioned it before, it not only alleviates the poverty in our communities, it brings benefit to the municipalities. And then, you know, we want to travel and we want to get out there and spend our money. And obviously, when we're building big infrastructure projects like this, it doesn't only help Canadian companies, it helps global companies that supply this demand of materials and infrastructure. And I just also think that, you know, we all have to think about this. This is a transition. This isn't going to happen overnight. And, you know, I'm just excited to be a part of this conversation. I think the theme, like positive energy, is great. And that's where we need to be at to have these conversations. And it isn't going to be easy. It's a bumpy ride, but we definitely, as Indigenous people, want to lead it. And I see with a lot of the projects that are happening in Canada, we are leading it as Indigenous nations. So yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Well, in a second, I'm going to want to open it up to the floor, but just I can't help with a bit of an observation, and goes also back to some of the conversations this morning. Is I guess I'll put it this way: when you're, and it comes, Anne, from your comment about back at the old days at NRCan, and one of the things that's characteristic of people when you get to be my age is that you know for certain that it was way better in that past that you can't remember. And in point of fact, maybe to put a positive note on this, we have made a lot of progress. And compared to then, and you're right, Anne, I mean, a lot of things, really important things, were treated as afterthoughts. And they're not treated as afterthoughts today. And in particular, Indigenous participation, but also a lot of other issues. So we have indeed made progress. It was just that there's a whole lot more in front of us. And the question is, how do we work together to make that happen? But I'm going to open it up to the floor for questions. And I've got some of my own, but if I see questions.
Lisa, I see our deliberative democracy exercise is getting quite a bit of interest in the chat, which is good.
Yeah. Yes,
Okay.
and I put up a link that
Oh,
I
great.
found to
Good.
something.
Thanks.
It's a commentary on what was done, but it gives a good example.
Okay, great.
Okay, I'm looking around the, yeah, we have a question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm full of questions. Justin Cruson here from Electricity Canada, but I used to work actually in the geothermal energy field. So congratulations, Chief Gale. It's been too long, I think, but fitting, I guess, that the first megawatt of geothermal power in Canada will be Indigenous owned anyways. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, it's late in the day here. I'm getting a little like wonky inside my head. But just a crazy idea. So in grad school, I looked a little bit at a thing called Pothole Theory. And at least in the political science literature, it's used to kind of describe political parties and their tendency over time to move towards the center as they deal with real problems, and their kind of extremist thoughts don't solve issues like potholes. Pothole just grows until one day it swallows a car and you have to do something about it. And that requires kind of the real grounded solutions. So I guess, it's based on all sorts of wonky thought, but sometimes I wonder if we're just in our own kind of extremist phase here as a country or countries. And I would just be interested in your comments. Do you think like there's real use? And I think we should keep trying to have these conversations, of course, but I mean, is this just sort of polarized times that we need to kind of let the left have their kick at the can, let the right have their kick at the can, everyone fails, and eventually we really have some, we just need to actually work on the real problem with some pragmatic solutions. And just a little plug for our association and Mike and your work with Positive Energy. We work together to just, put out some research, and we called kind of for that. A national task force that has the conversation. And when it comes to net zero, we know that's not going to cost nothing. It's likely going to cost a fair bit, actually. How do we deal with those costs pragmatically? And how do you split them between provinces and the feds? So that's a kind of long-winded rant there, but I'm just wondering your thoughts on, the what I just said here, and are we doomed to just have to fail before we make some steps forward?
Okay, for anyone who wants to join in, there's several things you can comment on and several questions you could address yourselves to. So
I think the chief, Mike, Chief, did you want to go first?
Yeah, please. So I think we need to look at this as a holistic view in this country of how we move these projects forward. As Indigenous people, we don't have borders. I'm living in the northeast corner of BC, and I'm cut off by my relatives in Alberta and Northwest Territories in the Yukon. And so as a country, we need to come together to build these projects. We can't be like in a competition with other provinces and other regions within our provinces. It's even for First Nations, we have to bring people together and look at this as a holistic approach. First Nations, when the topic comes up with government and industry, we're sometimes looked at as just another box to tick. But that's not the way moving forward if they want to have a meaningful partnership on projects. And I think that, developing this strategy nationally is key in developing innovative solutions and ensuring that not only every Canadian benefits, but the Indigenous communities that where the resources or the projects being built benefit. You know, it's their natural resources. And, you know, we've always want to be a part of our economic streams. And for the past 100 years, that hasn't happened for us. And so now we are no longer allowing these kind of things to move forward without our participation. And so I think, you know, the more that we can continue to improve and grow these relationships based on recognition of rights and title, mutual respect and trust, the further we're going to go. You know, the world is watching what we're doing right now. And I think we really need to put our collective imaginations together on reconciliation, on finding new paths to do business, to finding new paths to financing projects in this country, and not look at it as a competition. We're all Canadians. We're all working diligently and creatively to try to establish a new model, you know, so Indigenous people can be a part of the economies. But the access to capital is just hanging us up to dry, like, and we need to get over that so that, you know, we can be meaningfully involved in these projects and that we can finance them and that we can be competitive. So thank you.
You know, you asked whether we were doomed to failure, the gentleman who raised the question. We cannot afford to fail, which is why, Lisa, the coalition came together, right?
Yeah.
We 131 organizations decided at this stage, coming out of COVID, looking around the world at what is happening, we cannot afford to fail. We cannot be complacent. Economic growth, inclusive, sustainable economic growth, that we are at an inflection point. And it's not a crisis exactly like COVID because it's not in your face, right? The way COVID was, with people going into hospitals and tragically dying. But inclusive, sustainable economic growth that goal will become a crisis unless we figure out, to the chief's point, how we all work together to get there. So failure is not an option, which is why, and Lisa, I'm throwing this to you, you gave a call out to Minister Wilkinson around his regional tables.
Yeah.
And here's an example, and consultation, we've had lots of it, but he is trying something a little different, more inclusive. And to your point, Chief, a model that maybe gets us past some of this federal, provincial, stakeholder bashing, if you like.
Yeah, if you take a look at what the minister has announced, he is going into different geographic regions of the country and he's setting up smaller tables. But again, it's not going to be your typical round table that you've been invited to by a million other ministers where everyone goes around the table and says something, the minister goes home and forgets about it. It's very different. This is going to be having corporate Canada at the table, as well as Indigenous, as well as the small chambers, as well as individuals. And it's about one thing only. As we move to net zero, what can we possibly do here that makes the most sense for our geographic area? And how do we get that to happen? And I think instead of approaching it from a national point of view, which is, you can get lost even thinking about what your parameters will look like for such a council, doing it on the local level makes a whole lot more sense. And quite frankly, solutions are found at the local level. And that's where you amplify them. To the point though about pothole theory, one of the reasons why I enjoy working with Anne is that she has been through the war in terms of dealing with an existential threat to our country. And that had to do with when we hit the debt wall, right, Anne?
Yeah.
You guys were faced with a real problem. And, you know, was it fun filling that pothole all at that one time? Did you enjoy it? No.
No.
Country didn't enjoy it either.
No, absolutely not. But you know what we did? I mean, it was a shame that the country got to that point. But what Finance Minister Martin was able to do with the help of a lot of Canadians and the provinces and territories, the private sector, everybody knew that we were about to hit the debt wall. And unless some pretty significant changes took place, we were not going to be the Canada that we all wanted and prosper, and other countries and other the capital markets weren't going to buy our bonds because we were a poor credit risk. And a country just can't end up in that situation. So you did the tough stuff and everybody came together. A little bit like COVID, Lisa and Chief. At the beginning, for those first 6 months, I describe them as, you know, a shining moment where provincial governments, a private sector, a CAE, for example, you know, turned on a dime and started producing ventilators. But they're just one example of companies all over this country who joined with governments at all levels and healthcare agencies across the country to deal with the crisis. So Canadians actually kind of liked what they saw. They said, oh my gosh, we can actually do this. We can park all the partisan garbage and we can actually work together. Now, we don't want to get to that point, right? We don't want our commitment to sustainable economic growth, inclusive growth, to get to a crisis point.
That's right.
But that's why Canadians are telling us, when Lisa and I travel across the country, we want to see more collaboration. We want the partisan bickering, federal, provincial, municipal, to stop. We want people, private sector, Indigenous communities. We want people at the tables, which is why I think Lisa and I both agree that we have to give Minister Wilkinson a real shot here to try and do some things better.
Eric, can I come back to the regional tables? And again, I don't want anybody who has a question, please jump in, because I think this is an important one, particularly on this issue, because I mean, we all of us, I mean, most of us anyway, have been for years talking about the need for a national strategy, and it has always seemed a little bit unrealistic, maybe more than a little bit. And Minister Wilkinson's initiative does seem like maybe a quite refreshing approach. That seems to be your view. But it was interesting this morning talking with another colleague who was here, who felt that it had a lot of potential upsides, but it also had risks, including risks that it was going to create expectations that they weren't going to be able to realize. And I wonder if anybody has any comments on that. Is that regional approach all upside, or are there potential downsides from doing that, Lisa?
So you know what bothers me? By the way, Mike, you used to have the best phrase ever about energy. You used to say we need the right form of energy at the right time in the right place. I know I'm butchering your quote right there. Can you remind me what you used to say?
If anybody from the Canadian Gas Association is still here, I'm sure they'll appreciate it.
Oh, that's true. I remember. So listen, the reason why I put up my hand to talk about it is, what is the risk you're talking about? The risk you're identifying is of not being able to fulfill what people are expecting of you. That's a political risk, my friend. That's a political risk. Politics should not be part of that conversation. They shouldn't be thinking about whether or not they're going to get reelected or not elected on the basis of what they're trying. What they should be thinking about is, how do I get this done? And how do I get people to move in the direction together and not be so much worried about whether or not you're going to get people to put your name in the ballot box, but whether or not you're doing the right thing to ensure sustainable, inclusive, long-term economic growth, moving us to net zero with as the less amount of damage and the biggest amount of opportunity possible.
Okay, good perspective.
Mike, can I just clarify? It's easy to call what Minister Wilkinson is doing as regional. They're actually not. They're province by province, right? And his first series of roundtables are involving, not as a group, but individually, Manitoba, British Columbia, Newfoundland, and Labrador. And he's going province by province. And then it's because he wants to draw upon the productive capacities, the value add from each province, and have Indigenous communities from each province around the table, have the private sector. And yeah, I mean, boundaries, as the chief has indicated, are often artificial creations, but he is going province by province, which I think makes this quite different than some of the things we've tried in the past.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Chief Cal?
Yeah, I just have to say that I feel like Minister Wilkinson is really creating a lot of hope for First Nation Major Projects Coalition members. Just in our conversation, very supportive of this initiative. and helping move forward reconciliation with our members. And I feel that he is open to new and innovative ways to be able to work with us. He knows what our concerns are, and he showed up at our conference, and he made the announcement on the national energy strategy, and I think it was meaningful. And I feel that as partners, whether you're industry or the private sector or Indigenous, we just need to put our collective imaginations together and do the hard work. If we see something that's not right, we need to speak up, and we need to make those phone calls. I just look forward to a brighter future where we're not left behind no more, and we're alongside with Canadians in the economy, and 7 generations from now are prospering, and not only our kids but your kids. So I think he has provided a lot of hope for us. Obviously there's always challenges, but ready to have those conversations and try to overcome those challenges.
Okay, good. Again, open to, do I have a question? Yes.
Yes, hi. Corinne Glenn from the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. My question is, you've all spoken about what great things can be achieved when we can sit together and have the conversation. How do you bring people together when the polarization's already happened? If you reach out and you say, let's come to the table, let's have a conversation. Dr. Gattinger and I have talked about different tactics to try to get people who have already made up their mind about you to come and talk to you and have that conversation so you can move forward together. So any advice from any of you on how to do that? I'm happy to report we have good success with Indigenous communities, and we do have great conversations with them. It's more the more polarized environmental groups or some different citizens group how do you bring them to the table?
Anybody want to tackle that one?
So this year we had a very, very successful conference, and it was called Net Zero by 2050. And it was led by our organization with First Peoples Worldwide, which is in the United States, that works on these kind of initiatives also. But we had 1,300 people participate, and 1,000 of those people were in person. And that it brought people from America, from Europe, Canada, Indigenous communities, Indigenous people from other countries together to have this conversation. And, it was very nice to be able to do that, because not only did we have the conversation, we were able to embrace our cultures, our language, and our diversity as First Nation people, and share that with others from around the world about what needs to happen, not only in Canada, but globally. And so next year we're going to have a conference. It's going to be April 24th and 25th. We haven't decided where it's going to be, but I really encourage you to participate and be a part of that.
Okay, anybody else on this one? I have another question at the back.
Bringing a question from our virtual audience, which is about policy stability. So do you think we can reach a bipartisan or societal consensus on climate policy in Canada? A theme of today has been the need for policy certainty to enable investors to make long-term investments confidently. Successive governments undoing what previous governments have done, for example, the carbon tax in Alberta, remains very problematic. Thank you.
Comments on that?
I feel like they're looking at me when they talk about that. So I'll go first, if you don't mind, Anne. I would say that there are lots of things that a sitting government with a majority can do in order to make their policies stick beyond the next electoral event. And some of it has to do with private sector contracting, and other has to do with maybe embedding it in legislation, which is far more difficult than it is to do some private sector contracting. But what I would like to say, though, is I believe that we are at a point in our society where net zero has been accepted and anticipated by the capital markets to an extent that there's no turning back. And any government coming in, regardless of what they espouse to be their political ideology is going to have a really hard time unwinding the inertia that is in place right now when it comes to net zero. It may not be perfect, and Chief, I totally get it when you talk about the fact that we need to fix what's going on in capital markets for Indigenous investment. Without a doubt, we got to figure that part out, and the de-risking and how we can make the two work together better. But I think the reality is that we are so far down the path when it comes to the vision of moving to net zero that it's going to happen. The question is, how quickly will it happen, and how expensive, and what will people say? But it's not going to be a holus bolus. We no longer care about the environment, because you don't have 100% agreement on that in the Conservative Party of Canada. There's a lot of conservatives who care about having solid policy going forward that is going to shepherd in, as I said, not just a net zero decarbonized world, but one with opportunity that can only be, I guess, attained by a country such as Canada that has all the critical minerals that is needed in the world for all the things that we need to do.
Brendan, I think some of your work, I got to say I didn't read the whole report, but I will, I promise. But you were, I think, you suggested that, to Lisa's point, that basically in this country, there is a consensus, and a growing consensus, around net zero 2050. And if that's the case, then that becomes, and it's certainly true for the coalition, right? And targets for 2030 too. And some of our members might prefer Prime Minister Harper's targets for 2030. Others might prefer Prime Minister Trudeau's for 2030. But there's no disagreement. There's a target for 2030 too, right? Yeah. Among our members, we all know that, and we all agree with that. You know, whether the carbon price, and I think there's generally agreement, well, certainly within the coalition, that you put a price on carbon, but there'll be discussions, and one hopes respectful discussions, around whether it's 170 by 2030, or whether it's only on industrial emitters, or whether it's on the broad-based society. Those are legitimate public policy discussions on which we would hope, going back to deliberative democracy, that you can bring people together and not demonize each other, but actually have respectful discussions where you understand each other's position. But Brendan, I'd be interested, I mean, in terms of what your research and talking to people, and I guess those 50 people, women, or others, but I do think there's a consensus, and I've been doing some research on Generation Z, which are largely, 8 to 95 and beyond right now, I think 96 maybe. They may start to determine, and millennials, outcomes here for a lot of the rest of us. And they don't have any question around the fact that climate change is one of their top issues, and that they expect their governments to fix it.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
if you want to do deeper research on Gen Z, I'll send you my 2 teenagers for a weekend. More than welcome.
Brendan, in addition to Lisa's 2 teenagers, what can you contribute?
Yeah, so the political consensus on net zero by 2050, it happened pretty quickly. Like we started talking about this study in mid 2019, and net zero by 2050, I believe the UN Special Report on 1.5 was the first report to sort of mainstream that concept, and it got taken up in the span of like 2 or 3 years. You even saw it from like the first interview to the final interview. It started getting addressed way more frequently. I agree completely, Anne, that the price path for the federal price on pollution is a completely legitimate debate to have, right? How much do the heavy lifting do we want that to do? How much do we want supplementary or complementary policies to fill in the gaps? And just to the individual who asked the question online, in terms of policy stability on the carbon price, I would refer people who are interested to the work at the Canadian Climate Institute. They're looking at a mechanism called carbon contracts for differences, by which the government basically guarantees a carbon price, which assures a certain rate of return for investors.
And Minister Wilkinson has talked about that as well. He has said that the government's looking at contract for differences.
Yeah, there are smart people working on that problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to take us back to another theme, the one that came up in an earlier panel. And I'll try to sort of characterize the sort of two sides of this. One is the value, and I'll be interested in everybody's perspective on this, when you have these collaborative engagements, the value of what I'll call constructive ambiguity, that allow you to get talking without necessarily being forced into confrontation. But the other side of that is that you can end up spending a lot of time talking past each other. Or as one of our panelists talked about, you get a lot of happy talk and nothing actually gets done. And you know, Ann and Lisa and Chief Gale, in your work on these collaborative kind of things, you know, where's the right balance in terms of how blunt we are, how direct we are, how much we kind of, you know, edge around things? Where do you go with that?
I'll let you start, Ann.
Or at least.
I agree, Chief. Yeah. Ann's a good person to go on this one.
Well, look, I think a certain amount of, you have to decide, I guess, first of all, who's in the room, and you hope that they are willing to have constructive conversations. That's why I think your stakeholders, who you put around the table, is really important. And you can't have people simply pick people who, you know, going in agree with you, because that's useless. So you have to identify what the big sticking points are, and then put people around the table who are willing to come and park some of their own preconceptions and talk about those big sticking points, right? And it doesn't mean in the first meeting or the second meeting or even the third. And I'm sure the minister will find this out with his tables, provincial tables, that it's going to be hard work. And Chief, you said this, it's going to be hard work. And you cannot keep avoiding. I wouldn't suggest, you know, your first meeting, sure, you put people in the room, they get to know each other, kind of staking out their positions, but there has to come a point in all of this, if we're going to get this inclusive, sustainable economic growth, that people around the table talk about the big important issues. And one would be a big one, the future of the fossil fuel industry. But as again, I go back to one of Minister Wilkinson's speeches, I think at PDAC maybe, as he said, it's not about fossil fuels, it's about the emissions from fossil fuels, right? Yeah. So let's focus on the real issue, right? It's emissions from fossil fuels, it's combustion. And and maybe Brendan, this goes to your point too, in terms of identifying for people what the real issues are, as opposed to creating imaginary ones. And I just think sometimes it's hard, but what are the real issues that we need to bear down on? And let's find models and vehicles by which to do that, knowing it's hard work, it's going to take time. But the other thing I would say is, I think the private sector and in private sector, civil society, and here I include Indigenous communities, Chief, in both the private sector and civil society, they are actually going to put, they're going to, at the end of the day, drive this agenda. And governments will pay a huge price if they do not listen to the capital markets, to the private sector, to Indigenous Canadians, and probably the younger generation in all those areas, right? We're in a huge, big societal transition. It's not only about energy and the environment. We are transitioning to quite a different world. And I think governments will pay a price if they don't listen.
So Ann, I think also what's important is accountability. So for the folks who go to these panels and they talk to one another and they go away and they don't do anything, it's very important for them to be held accountable. So Ann, do you have something with you that measures accountability?
Our scorecard.
Bingo. The scorecard has 21 metrics, and in those metrics, we are seeking to establish whether or not, as a society on the whole, are we doing the things we need to do? Do we have the right policies in place in order to get to a sustainable, inclusive future? Because the Coalition for a Better Future does not prescribe what the policies are going to be. Our members will do that. Some will pitch for lower taxes, others will pitch for more transfers. I mean, it's all over the map in terms of who we have with us. But the scorecard is what allows us to see, are we really doing what we need to do? And do we need to encourage corporate Canada? Do we need to encourage civil society? Do we need to encourage somebody else to take a look? Maybe if I could just get indulged for 1 second, and on the scorecard, maybe you can hold it up again and talk about one of your favorite metrics.
Well, I have a number of favorite ones, and I may not talk first about the one you're referencing because the chief is here. And
Yes.
In fact, we have 3 big chunks in our scorecard: growing sustainably, winning globally, living better. And Chief, you talked about earlier the importance of Indigenous men and women being around the board table in positions of influence, actually being part of the strategic planning and making key decisions for their communities and for investment and so on. So under human capital, we had we thought one of the metrics should be percentage of Indigenous people in the workforce. Indigenous stakeholders said to us, no, that is not good enough. It should be share of Indigenous people in senior management positions, because they are the ones, Chief, who will be around the board table. They are the ones who will be shaping the strategic plans for private sector companies who, with you in partnership, want to develop programs. So it was really important in our metrics to take on board what our stakeholders, our member organizations, were telling us. And no, it's not good enough to have Indigenous Canadians all working at McDonald's. Those are entry-level jobs. Indigenous leaders want to know how inclusive we are and how many Indigenous people are actually around the board table influencing decision-making, capital decisions, and the future. So we took that on board. So all that to say, 21 metrics. Our first year, they're going to be independently assessed. Now it's upside down. It will be independent. They will be independently assessed by a verifier starting the end of this year out till 2030 as an initial cut. We have targets, Mike, for each one of these 21 metrics. You can go on our website and find the targets, their stretch for 2030. But we believe if we meet these targets in these 21 metrics, this country will be the world's most inclusive, sustainable economy and leading economic growth. And then we have traditional, R&D in the private sector. Stuart Elgie, who everybody in this room knows, helped us with our GHG metrics. We have 3 of them, and so on, right? So, Lisa's right. This isn't to punish anyone. It's to hold us all accountable. Governments, private sector, civil society. And Lisa will put up the link, or someone will, to our scorecard.
Yep.
Because if you don't have it, you should get it.
Thank you, Anne. So just going into what Anne had to say, for Fort Nelson First Nation, we want to be an economic powerhouse, and we want to do that flip. I don't want my people working seasonal work, when they're laid off. When spring comes, spring breakup, and they're depressed and they're sitting on the couch and they can't provide for their families. By having equity ownership, we're going to have board of director seats at the table. We're going to have people as CEOs and management. And also, this last Friday, we celebrated the 40th anniversary of Challow School, which is a private school that's opened up to the public for the past 40 years. And non-Indigenous people get bused to town, and we are able to share our language and our culture in those efforts. But, this is where the real work gets done, is by having ownership. And it doesn't need to be all about profits, because an Indigenous person, the environmental stewardship component is very important. And I feel that that's why it's so important that we're a part of this, because Indigenous thinking and ownership creates the necessary conditions to achieve the shared goals that are wanted by all of us. If we're going to reach to net zero, then this reconciliation conversation needs to happen. And I truly believe that we're not going to get to net zero by 2030 goals or our net 2050 goals if we don't start including the Indigenous component of us being involved. And, you know, when we were talking about the original question, is I encourage all of you, no matter what career you hold, if you're in this space, then you have to talk about how this transition is not going to move forward without us, because all the critical minerals are on our territories. And also that, you know, we have so many challenges with access to capital. So if we don't have access to capital as Indigenous people and partners, the projects aren't going to be built. And, you know, that has to be competitively priced capital. We need the same opportunities as the business community. And through the facilitation and the help of the coalition, we're able to make decisions at the speed of business. And this capacity comes free of charge to our members. So that's huge. I mean, right now I'm sitting in Toronto at Tori's office that's helping us with our 2-day COP project. And, you know, we want to be leaders in the energy transition, and we will be, because we're not giving up, and we will say no when we had to say no. And we have said no when it didn't mean we were going to be involved in a meaningful way. You can't just come to our territories anymore and just rape and pillage our territories. I seen that with the fracking that happened, and there were so many cumulative impacts that happened in a short period of time. So most of you are very familiar with the Blueberry River court case, and those were the concerns that were happening for our people, because traditional knowledge is so important in these processes, because we can tell you, our elders can tell you what's happening on the land before you can collect your data and analyze it. And that's why moving forward, if we're going to get ahead of this looming climate emergency, we simply cannot get this wrong. We must work together as true partners and ensure that we have a shared vision for the low carbon future. First Nations have been stewards of our lands for thousands of years, and we know that the lives of our future generations depend on this.
Okay, well, that's a good note to wrap up on, and which is exactly on time. So thank you all for that, and for some very, very lively interventions on this topic. And so, Monica, I think I'm going to hand it over to you. And while you're coming up here, I'm going to invite everybody to thank our panel for their excellent contributions.